Thank you, General McKenzie. I now recognize myself for questions. We have Sergeant Tyler Vargas Andrews here today. I want to thank you, sir, for your service and your courage for testifying before this committee almost a year ago to the day. He was a sniper at Abbey Gate and testified to us that he had the suicide bomber in his sights, that was identified on the Be on the Lookout. He sent the sniper photos and other related documents to his commanding officer for permission to engage the suicide bomber. Yet that warning was ignored. He never heard back. I and the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, after that testimony, sent a letter to the Department of Defense requesting that these documents and sniper photos be delivered to the Congress, produced to the Congress by this document, this letter request. To date, that has been ignored. The Department of Defense has refused. We've also requested the testimonies of General Chris Donahue and Admiral Peter Vaisley, who were the commanding officers on the ground during the Abbey Gate disaster. To both of you, to General Milley, do you think that these documents should be turned over to the United States Congress? And do you think that both General Donahue and Admiral Vaisley should testify before Congress?
Sure, I absolutely do. I believe transparency. You're the board of directors for this corporation called the American government, and I believe that you're entitled to those within the bounds of classification. Absolutely. So whatever documents are out there should be turned over to the appropriate committees of jurisdiction and oversight. And whatever witnesses are needed to establish truth and transparency within the bounds of classification should absolutely happen. Absolutely. That's why I'm here.
Thank you.
Chairman, I agree with General Milley, and I associate myself with his remarks.
So also on accountability, I've asked the State Department officials who was responsible for the catastrophic emergency evacuation. Not surprisingly, they point their fingers at the Department of Defense. But I want to set the record straight. While the DoD helps conduct the emergency evacuation, it's a State Department that is responsible under law for developing the plan and leading the evacuation. Is that your understanding?
Yes. The State Department is the lead federal agency for planning and execution, oversight of the execution of the non-combatant operation. And the Department of Defense is in support of, and other departments are in support of the State Department. The State Department's the lead federal agency for NEOs. That's correct.
General McKenzie?
I agree with that.
And it's the State Department responsible under law, again, for requesting the emergency evacuation. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I think that's done at the ambassadorial level, to tell you the truth. I'd have to check the law, but I think the ambassador can make the decision to execute a NEO, but typically it'll be him or the Secretary of State.
And did the State Department, specifically Embassy Kabul, have an evacuation plan for Afghanistan?
So, Chairman, every embassy has an evacuation plan for Afghanistan. And Embassy Kabul had a plan, had what we would call an F-77 list, which is the list of U.S. Citizens and their families that are in the country. And we struggled to gain access to that plan and work with them over the months of July until we finally got a decision to execute the NEO, which, as I've already mentioned, occurred on the 14th of August. Now, we worked with the embassy before then, but we didn't have authority to move out and do the things that you have to do to make a NEO happen until the 14th of July, or correction, the 14th of August. And as I noted, we were in extremis at that point.
And August 14th, just days before the fall of Kabul and the evacuation of the embassy, August 14th is when they finally put forward this plan?
Now, that's when we got authority to execute the plan.
That's when you got authority to, and you urged the White House and State Department to put pen to paper to develop a plan to get Americans and our Afghan allies out of Afghanistan, correct?
Yes, I did. In fact, I was concerned by the middle of July. I was concerned about the different pace of Department of Defense planning as compared to Department of State planning. And I took an opportunity then to make representations to the Secretary about my concern over that, the fact that we were moving pretty fast on this. They were not moving fast, and I was concerned that we were going to arrive at different locations just based on it. And I went to the Secretary. We spent some time talking about that, and actually followed up with a written idea on some things that we could do. Sent a letter with 10 recommendations to the Secretary of Defense on that.
And is that your recollection, General Milley?
Absolutely. Without breaching things like executive privilege, et cetera, my assessments at the time, and Frank McKenzie submitted assessments, Scott Miller submitted assessments, the general consensus of the military, up through and including the Secretary of Defense, was that the embassy should be coming out, roughly speaking, at the same time we should be coming out. And then after the decisions were made to keep a diplomatic presence there, as the situation deteriorated through the summer and the fall of the provincial capitals, et cetera, we were clearly pressing for early calls to execute a NEO.
And they did eventually develop a plan?
Well, go ahead on the planning.
So they had a plan. Like I said, it's a requirement to have the plan, but it's one thing to have the plan. It's a second thing to do the actual coordination on the plan, to talk about the specifics of execution. So having a plan is one thing, preparing the plan, vetting the plan, coordinating the plan with the people that are going to actually carry you out, the Department of Defense, that's another set of tasks completely.
And that was too little, too late.
It was my judgment that it was far too little, far too late.
Was that your assessment, General Milley?
It was, and I would broaden it a little bit by saying it was a pretty consistent assessment by me and other members of the uniformed military, up to and including the Secretary, that the withdrawal of the military forces and the contractors and the NATO forces that went with it would ultimately lead, as I said in my opening statement, to a general collapse of the ANSF and the government. And as I mentioned, the tension was, when would those conditions be made? It was also our assessment at the time that keeping an embassy open in a war zone, which Afghanistan was, and to do that without the presence of the U.S. military and the contractors, NATO, et cetera, that embassy would be untenable.
And that was your advice to the State Department and the White House?
Well, as you know, because of the requirements of executive privilege, et cetera, I can tell you what my assessments were at the time, and those were my thoughts at the time.
Do you believe
I'm a
that
pretty
their failure to plan timely created the chaos at HKIA Airport?
I think the call to execute the NEO came too late, and as General McKenzie mentioned, it was officially logged in on the 14th. At that point in time, the Afghan government senior leadership was preparing to depart, and they departed the next day on the 15th. Thousands of Afghan civilians were gathering at the airport. The Afghan security forces were collapsing in the various provincial capitals, and although there were some still in and around Kabul. So the general situation at that point, with 750 U.S. soldiers in and around the embassy, the Turkish troops were required, along with some ANSF, to protect HKIA. They melted away. So you had a situation with the U.S. Embassy and 750 troops when that NEO was called, and now we had leaned forward. So I think it's the 9th, 10th, or 11th time frame. We had already put forces on alert, et cetera. But in essence, we alerted, Marshal deployed 82nd Airborne Division, Division Ready Brigade, and the MU out of Saudi that was underneath General McKenzie's control. They rapidly deployed along with special forces to take control of that airport. It took two to 3 days. That's where those videos come from. But they eventually wrested control of that airport.
And General McKenzie, you agree with that assessment?
I do. That reflects the opinion I had at the time and the opinion I had now.
Yeah, I believe that accountability ensures mistakes of the past are not repeated. But from where I sit, the President and this administration refuse to acknowledge their failures. There's an inscription at the National Archives down the street that reads, "What is past is prologue." Now, I launched this investigation to make sure that the mistakes made in Afghanistan never, ever happen again. With that, I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by saying thank you. You are you're here voluntarily. Is that correct?
Correct. That is correct, sir.
Although you did receive the threat of a subpoena at one point. Is that also correct?
Received
A threat of being subpoenaed to come today.
Chairman McCall mentioned that he wanted us to appear, and that there are compulsory measures, which I took to mean subpoena, sure. But look at that wasn't necessary from the beginning.
I know you came voluntarily, but I just want to get the point out that there was something in regards to, a subpoena to come, correct?
I was not subpoenaed.
I said the threat of a subpoena to come, or something compulsory.
Answer it like this: before I retired, I testified several times, as well as John McKenzie, in open and classified hearings on Afghanistan. Prior to retirement, Chairman McCall asked me, would you be willing to discuss with the committee? I said, absolutely, yes. No threat of subpoena, no compulsory, nothing. I said, yes. I saw Chairman McCall again after retirement, and he reminded me of that conversation. I said, sure, absolutely. So in January and February of this year, we worked out, some of the details. I said I wanted to go back and review records, et cetera. And then it was originally supposed to be a closed, classified hearing, because I still think we're going to do one of those after this. And I thought that was important to be a classified hearing because a lot of information is still classified. And then there was this discussion of a public hearing.
Right, and so just speaking of that, when you've testified before the Armed Services Committee, is that correct?
Testified before the House and Senate Armed Services Committees in both classified and open hearings, and then have testified about Afghanistan and several other testimonies that weren't specific
Same with you,
to
right, General McKenzie?
That's correct, sir.
And is your testimony, has anything changed from when you were in uniform and testifying to what you've testified today? Has there anything that you didn't testify to before that you're testifying to now? Is there any change of thought of what took place today from what you testified to previously?
In general, for me, everything that I testified before is still true and accurate today, and in open testimony, that would be correct. I have learned more about Abbey Gate because of the investigations. That wasn't available during previous testimonies. For me, it wasn't. But I have since read those investigations and been briefed on them, but they weren't available the first time.
So your testimony today is still basically consistent and transparent to your testimony?
It's totally consistent.
General McKenzie?
That's the same for me.
Right. So there's not really anything new that was learned today because you've testified to it before, right?
I'll leave that to you all to determine if there's anything new.
I'm just asking you from your testimony and from what what has been made public and what has been public.
Sure.
Is basically, this is not something
So,
new.
Ranking Member, as I mentioned in my opening statement, much of what I say today is going to mirror the 10 hours of
That's my
testimony
point.
I gave
That this
earlier.
is not anything groundbreaking or anything that is being discovered newly. This is something that has been out in the public from the time that you testified back in 2022, right? Nothing groundbreaking here. Fact of the matter is, let me ask this question. I think maybe it was you, General Milley, said that the framework for what took place during the 20 years, because I think that we should be looking at, if we really want to figure out what went wrong, what we need to fix, we need to look at the entire 20 years of being in Afghanistan, not just the last few months. Would you say that's correct?
Yes, and I said that before as well in previous testimony. Now, in the written remarks that I'm submitting for the record, I've elaborated on what I think are, say, top 10 lessons learned, but there's many more. You're not going to learn all the lessons of a 20-year war in short sessions, but I think there's a huge amount of lessons to be learned over the course of 20 years. Should we have gone after bin Laden in 2001 in that winter when we had him more or less from an intel standpoint? We thought we had him located. Should we? Could we have? Yes. Should we have? I think yes. In hindsight, that would have changed the trajectory of the whole war. And there's a whole series of lessons along the way. Specific to this hearing and to help these families, I think the focus is more recent relative to the withdrawal itself and the Abbey Gate and the NEO. But you're correct. A holistic view, absolutely, I think, but that's going to take a considerable amount of time.
Would you say that the Doha agreement that was done under the Trump administration had some connection to the conditions on the ground when Joe Biden became president, and leading on up into to what took place at Abbey. There was a nexus there. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I think that the end game, if you will, the final, months, I think the framework of that is set by the Doha Agreement, absolutely.
So if we're going to study to find out the findings of what we should do, we should be talking about what happened during the Trump administration as well as what took place during the Biden administration, because they are connected. They're not separate. And so if we're serious about trying to figure out what took place and why it took place, we should be looking at both what took place under the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and is that not correct?
Sure. As you point out, 4 presidents. I think there's half a dozen secretaries of defense, half a dozen secretaries of state. There's half a dozen chairmen of Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's another 4 commanders in Afghanistan. So yes, there's absolutely lessons to be learned through all of this. And the end game, using the Doha Agreement, if you wanted to say that was the start point, sure, there's a lot to be said about that as well. And there is a continuum. As I mentioned in my opening statement, there's no phenomenon like the end of a war.
My point is this. If we're taking a serious look at this, you can't just take a peek at one little segment of it and say this is the reason everything happened without looking at what preceded it, because you'd have to look at it in its entirety. Isn't that correct? If you're serious about trying to figure out how we're going to make sure the mistakes that may have made and the things that we did right, you can only do that in a serious investigation if you take all of it and you look at all of it and you examine all of it, not just piecemealing that. Would you agree with that?
Of course. I mean, I said that in the opening statement. I said in previous testimony that a holistic look at the whole war in order to really determine outcomes, et cetera. And anything as complex as a war is not the result of a single causal factor. There's multiple factors and multiple decisions. So yes, in general, I agree. But I'm here for these families to try to get them answers and to try to get answers on the immediate issues that are at hand.
So I know the chairman went, so I just want to do the same amount of time that he had. I don't want to get cut off there. So let me ask this. With the conclusion of the Doha deal, the Taliban stopped attacking U.S. forces inside Afghanistan. Is that correct?
Well, yes, lethal attacks. They committed to not doing that. There were some attacks, but they committed to not conducting lethal attacks. And by my memory, I don't think there was a lethal attack on U.S. forces.
So let me ask this, because we're running out of time. I saw the chairman finished about with 5 minutes there. So, and when the United States committed to the Doha deal, that was to withdraw, and I quote, withdraw from Afghanistan all military forces of the United States, its allies, coalition partners, including all non-diplomatic civilian personnel, private security contractors, trainers, advisors, and supporting service personnel. Is that correct? That was the Doha deal done under the Trump administration. Is that correct?
As I recall, I think there was 7 conditions that the United States signed up to and 8 conditions that the Taliban signed up to. And I think you rattled off most of the key ones. It was a very explicit thing. It said you had to go from there were 13,000, more or less, 13,000 U.S. troops when Doha was signed, and then you had to go to 8,600 in 135 days.
Let me just do this. I want to make sure. And so, therefore, the withdrawal was well underway in January 2021 after President Trump withdrew U.S. forces, notwithstanding concerns about the Taliban's behavior. Is that correct?
The withdrawal was absolutely underway. The drawdown of forces was underway. That's correct.
So I don't have time, but I would like, because I would like to do a complete investigation. That is what I think that our committee has the responsibility, so that we can really be transparent with the American people on everything that took place in the 20 years in Afghanistan. Not just one piece, but everything, if we are serious and not playing politics with this issue.
Gentleman's time has expired. I will say the Afghanistan Commission has been commissioned to look at the last 20 years. The purpose of this investigation is to examine the evacuation. I will hold the members accountable at 5 minutes under the rules discipline, so that we can get to every member on this committee who deserves to be heard, and we thank you for showing up. And with that, I recognize Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this important hearing. Thank you to the two generals for your distinguished service to our country. Thank you so very much for that. You know, General Milley, you mentioned how you had suggested a minimum of 2,500 troops to remain. Who rejected your advice? Was it the president? Did you ever get a written or oral feedback as to why they rejected that advice?
Well, again, I can't say, you know, the president said this, the president said that. That's beyond the scope of the law, actually, with executive privilege. But it's obvious that the president made the decision, and the president made an announcement on the 14th. And our recommendation was, as I mentioned, or our thoughts at the time was, as I mentioned. And every president has a right to make those decisions. He's looking at things from a much wider angle than a military angle. Our military assessment was keep 2,500, and with them, it's not just 2,500. It's 2,500 plus the NATO plus the contractors.
Right.
And the contractors are key here. And then that, we thought, our assessment was, that would keep the Afghan government, the military, stable until such time as a diplomatic outcome could occur in accordance with the conditions set in the Doha Agreement.
In retrospect, would that have made the difference?
I mean, we'll never know, I guess, because it didn't happen. So I do think, though, that I believe that the Afghan government, the Afghan security forces would not have collapsed in August of 21 had we maintained that posture. Those were high-end special forces capable of defending themselves and conducting operations as they had been for a while. And I think my assessment, probably moderate to significant risk on U.S. forces, but is that worth that risk? Again, the Doha Agreement had conditions, but here was the problem for two presidents. Nobody that I recall, nobody, zero, could coherently argue how it would end or how those conditions, the diplomatic conditions, were going to be obtained. Not a military problem, but how are those diplomatic conditions going to be obtained?
Let me just ask you, I asked Secretary of State Blinken on September of 2021 about the infamous phone call with Ghani, and Reuters did get a copy of that phone call, about the transcript and apparently an actual verbatim. They listened to it. And in it he said that there's a need, whether it's true or not, this is our President of the United States saying this, whether it's true or not, there's a need to project a different picture about the Taliban's capabilities. General McKenzie, you talked about how there was no plan to get U.S. citizens out. And then there seemed to be a bewilderment on the part of the administration why Americans weren't flocking to leave. They didn't have many ways of doing it anyway. And I'm just wondering what you thought of that phone call. I mean, I asked Blinken, he said, you know, I don't talk about something that's been leaked. Well, is it true? Did he say that? You know, lying like that to me, when you give the false impression to a whole group of Americans who never then got out, that's very, very serious. Secondly, just let me ask, because I will run out of time, how many Americans were left behind? And again, I thank you that you did everything you could to make this policy work, but you were given a policy that was egregiously flawed. But how many Americans were left behind? How many of our allies? And what has happened to them? Have they been beaten, killed, tortured? And secondly, about all the weapons that were left behind, there are reports that some of it has found its way to Hamas. I don't know if that's true. I know you did everything you could on the way out to destroy them, but many were intact and left in the hands of the Taliban.
I can't speak to the phone call. I don't have any personal knowledge of that. Number of Americans. This was always an issue. The number of Americans, as General McKenzie said, an F-77 report is supposed to, every ambassador in every country of the world keeps an F-77 report, and they're supposed to track the Americans, where they're at, the phone numbers, address, et cetera, in the country. That was always a difficult number for us in the Department of Defense to get a hold of, and I think it's true at the tactical level and operational level as well. And I'll be candid. I don't know the exact number of Americans that were left behind because the starting number was never clear. Same is true of at-risk Afghans, SIVs, the commandos, other Afghans that serve with us. Those numbers varied so widely that they were quite inaccurate, as best I could tell at the time. I would just say I'm not sure, even today, about the accuracy of all those numbers.
Are they in jail, dead, some of them?
I think some were killed, Afghans. I don't know about the Americans. I don't think the Americans were, but I think some of the Afghans were tracked down that worked with us, and I think some of them were killed, and I'm pretty certain some of them in pretty brutal ways. Some were managed to escape through various means. Others have just laid low and keeping their heads down.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair